Hi everyone, and welcome to Week 5 on Testimonies and Integrated History in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Before we turn to the methodological challenges of testimonies, let's start with some basic principles of memory by drawing from the rich research program on memory studies. There's a basic three-part process of memory that psychologists have theorized since the late 1960s, and although it's been much scrutinized and refined since then, it still provides a good starting point. First, memory starts with the transformation of perceptual stimuli into a neurological memory code. This is selective. Not everything that you experience perceptually gets selected for encoding, because the amount of attention you have is limited. This is also elaborative, meaning that we encode into memory not what is actually happening, but what we interpret or perceive to be happening. So there's a subjective element to this. The second stage is storage, which itself is broken down into substages, starting with immediate brief sensory registers, maybe lasting a few seconds, to short-term memory to long-term memory. The final stage is retrieval, although this is a bit more complicated, as memory is not a thing per se. It's not like recording a video and storing it in an archive for later. Instead, memory recall involves reconstructing the past with the help of inferential reasoning. Again, this constructive aspect is inherently subjective, and yet memory is not simply an atomized individual property. Rather, memory is an inherently social phenomenon, from the very basic usage of a particular group's language to reminisce, to the social dimension that accompanies the act of communicating a memory. This is denoted by the concept of collective memory, which points to the necessary social frameworks of individual memory. All individual remembering takes place with social materials, within social context, and in response to social cues. Not only do individual memories depend on this social dimension, but societies themselves depend on collective memory, which provides long-term structures to what societies remember or commemorate that are stubbornly impervious to the efforts of individuals to escape them. Conversely, social structures also enable forgetting or denial, which may also be important elements in the constitution of a society. This duality of remembrance and denial also points to the spectral nature of memory, which, like history itself, is an imaginative reconstruction of the past that no longer exists. As we saw last week with history as a representation, it is a paradox to represent or to re-present a past that is forever gone. It is this imaginative reconstruction that poses important methodological problems. As historians or social scientists, we're not alone in dealing with the methodological problems of memory, as lawyers and philosophers have long grappled with the challenges of using testimony as evidence. Testimony is personal or documentary evidence or attestation in support of a fact or statement. Thus, to testify is to bear witness to, or to assert or affirm the truth of a statement. Etymologically, it comes from the Latin word for witness, referring to a subject who is or was present and is able to testify from personal observation. Yet, despite the empirical basis of testimonies, there is a long tradition in philosophy, going back to Plato, of contempt for arguments based on witness testimony as being unreliable, subjective, misleading, and impossible to evaluate as evidence by objective standards. Any argument as fallible as one based on witness testimony is easily seen as subjective in nature and simply beyond the range of any exact objective treatment. Likewise, in courts of law, there are some notorious cases of lying witnesses and wrongful convictions based on false or inaccurate witness testimony. According to one study, inaccurate eyewitnesses contributed to nearly 70% of the more than 375 wrongful convictions in the U.S. that were overturned by post-conviction DNA evidence. Accordingly, an important aspect of legal training involves evaluating eyewitness testimony. There are at least 4 possible sources of eyewitness error. First, was the witness in a position to accurately observe the events in question? Did they see it firsthand? How close or far were they from the incident? Was the light good? Were they wearing glasses? Things like that. Second, how were the witnesses' observations influenced by their state of mind, prior beliefs, and expectations? It's commonly supposed that people observe and remember more accurately under stress, but experiments indicate that instead of stress improving perception, it's more likely to weaken it. In fact, psychological studies suggest that people who witness fearful events remember the details of them less accurately than they recall ordinary happenings. Likewise, people's expectations and biases often color their memories. Third, in what ways have witnesses' recollection of events been influenced during the time between making the observations and giving testimony? As noted, human memory does not work like a videotape recorder or a movie camera. When a person wants to remember something, he or she does not simply pluck a whole memory intact out of a memory store. As we saw on the previous slide, memory is constructed from stored and available bits of information. Any gaps in the information are filled in unconsciously by inferences. When these fragments are integrated and make sense, they form what we call a memory. Finally, and most simply, the eyewitness may just be lying. But as we'll see, there's no simple binary between truth and lies, as the truth comes in many different sorts, as does lying. The issue of veracity and testimonies is all the more complicated when it comes to traumatic memories. By definition, trauma is historical in nature and stored in memory. Whether it is physiological, psychological, spiritual, cultural, whatever type of trauma it involves lasting injury or harm. Medical anthropologists Didier Fasson and Richard Rechtman thus define trauma as present suffering related to past violence. It is the intrusion of the past into the present. As a structure of experience, it's marked by an inherent latency and belatedness. A traumatic event is not simply experienced as it occurs, but only becomes fully evident later on, after the fact. In terms of our discussion this week, we are especially concerned with the cognitive effects of post-traumatic stress disorder. On the one hand, people with PTSD have deficient working, i.e., short-term memory. On the other hand, survivors may experience flashback memories, which involve a reliving of traumatic experiences, a sense of being in the past, rather than recalling the past. Importantly, there is evidence that flashbacks are not necessarily veridical accounts of traumatic experiences. That is to say, they're not necessarily objective or empirically accurate reconstructions of what actually happened. Studies have demonstrated that the content of flashback memories can change over time and are influenced by current concerns. This point is reflected in the widely noted distinction in the literature on Holocaust testimonies between common memory and deep memory. Common memory refers to the normal, historically grounded, and chronologically charted memory that we're familiar with. In terms of Holocaust and genocide testimonies, this occurs when an oral narrator recalls their experiences from the perspective of their pre- or post-genocide self. Common memory is fairly straightforward. First this happened, then this, then that, so on and so forth. As we'll see, organizations that record testimonies often favor this type of easily accessible memory that seemingly enables a sense of closure. Yet the desire for rationally ordered survivor testimonies is often interrupted by the intractable return of the repressed and recurring deep memory, that which continues to exist as unresolved trauma just beyond the reach of meaning. Deep memory refers to those memories that record the physical imprint of a traumatic event within the individual. They are lodged deeply within a survivor's body, prone to involuntary eruptions. This tension between deep and common memory poses a critical methodological conundrum for researchers. Take the case of Serena, whose last name is withheld, a Holocaust survivor who was interviewed for the Fortunoff Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies at Yale. Her story was famously recounted by Dori Laub, an Israeli psychiatrist and psychoanalyst at Yale who is not only a Holocaust survivor himself, but also led the way in video recording survivor testimonies. Anyways, Laub tells the story of an academic conference in the mid-1980s, where they showed Serena's recorded testimony. In it, Serena recalls seeing 4 crematoria chimneys going up in flames during the 1944 Sonderkommando uprising in Birkenau. Objectively speaking, this was inaccurate. Only 1 chimney was blown up, not 4. This mistake, Laub reports, ignited a debate, as the historians at the conference felt that this inaccuracy could jeopardize the struggle against deniers. In turn, a psychoanalyst at the conference, who was later confirmed to be Laub himself, objected that Serena was simply speaking to a deeper level of extreme experience related to historical trauma. This debate speaks to two different conceptions of the truth. On the one hand, historical truth searches for factual accuracy that can be corroborated and cannot be dismissed or denied. It is time-bound and is dedicated to the strict observance of what we introduced in Week 4 as correspondence theory, where the aim is to come as close as possible to what quote-unquote really happened. On the other hand, psychoanalysis, which by the way began as a theory of trauma, is geared towards what it calls narrative truth, which involves a subject trying to make coherent sense of a traumatic past in order to achieve some degree of closure. These traumatic memories may not be empirically accurate, in the sense of corresponding with what quote-unquote really happened, but they nevertheless represent actual lived experiences. Just because they may be empirically inaccurate makes them no less true. This divergence is reflected in the etymology of the keyword truth, the dominant meaning of which is in accordance with fact or reality, reflecting the world or state of things as they actually exist. Notably, this connotation is etymologically more recent, dating back to the early modern era. At a deeper etymological level, the original meaning of truth was being characterized in good faith, as in being authentic, true to oneself, genuinely felt. In that sense, Serena's testimony demonstrated a narrative truth, not a historical truth. It was empirically inaccurate, but nevertheless reflected a lived experience. Again, these divergent notions of the truth pose critical methodological issues for dealing with testimonies, as our readings this week by Zoe Waxman and Christopher Browning both frame a common dilemma with using survivor testimonies. On the one hand, sticking with the broader sense of narrative truth as defined by authenticity, there are some scholars who view survivor testimonies in quasi-spiritual or sacred terms and believe that they should be afforded the utmost respect and reverence. Other scholars don't necessarily go this far, but still nevertheless afford survivor testimonies a certain degree of deference, as with Jan Gross, for example, who we'll read next week, and who argues that we should, by default, accept the veracity of survivor testimonies until we find persuasive arguments to the contrary. On the other hand, pointing toward the narrow sense of historical truth as defined by veracity, there are some scholars who view survivor testimonies in more instrumental terms, insofar as they provide micro-level data that can be quote-unquote mined by researchers for various illustrative means. Arguably, Saul Friedlander's approach could fit within this category. Other Holocaust scholars, including very eminent ones like Raoul Hilberg and Lucy Davidovitz, avoided using survivor testimonies altogether due to the extent to which they are sometimes riddled with empirical errors, as we saw with the case of Serena and the 4 chimneys supposedly blown up during the Auschwitz uprising. It is of course possible to find a middle ground. On the one hand, we can use the subjective authenticity of testimonies to supply meaning, not strictly in terms of facts, but in terms of exploring the depths of human experiences during genocide. On the other hand, in terms of obtaining objective veracity of the past, we can also use survivor testimonies not only to provide illustrative empirical details, but, as we'll see with Friedlander's integrative approach, to also insert a human element into what may otherwise be a cold, hard reconstruction of the past. Before we return to the methodological issues with witness testimonies, I do want to call attention to the major repositories of Holocaust and genocide testimonies. As noted earlier, the Fortunoff Archive at Yale was a pioneer in collecting video testimonies of Holocaust survivors. With approximately 4,400 video testimonies, the archive is very protective of its holdings, maintaining a single on-site access point at Yale University's library, while ensuring that only the most dedicated and rigorous students, educators, and scholars will travel to Yale in order to access the collections. This restriction has limited the broader circulation of its holdings. In terms of interview methodology, the Fortunoff Archive emphasizes witness agency to tell their own stories. Unlike some other repositories, it doesn't necessarily favor neat, chronological narratives with cathartic or redemptive aspects. From its inception, the Fortunoff Archive emphasized the human dimensions of suffering at the heart of the Holocaust, rather than the broader historical picture. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum also houses a sizable collection of testimonies, although these reflect the museum's institutional preferences, as they are used to enable visitors to meet Holocaust survivors through audio-visual media. In terms of interview methodology, this tended towards a concern for interviews' exhibition rather than archival value, as the curative process was used to mine recordings for the much-coveted nuggets. Only segments of a select few are included in the exhibits, but all of the interviews remain unedited within the archive. Finally, the USC Shoah Foundation has the largest collection of testimonies, over 50,000, which it is working to digitize and make accessible to students, researchers, and the general public. It includes survivors not just from the Holocaust, but from other genocides as well, including Armenia, Cambodia, Rwanda, and Guatemala. I encourage you all to register for free with its Visual History Archive and explore their holdings. In terms of interview methodology, the Shoah Foundation has developed practices that shape testimonial accounts into coherent and accessible narrative segments that implicitly uses a dramaturgical or cinematic storytelling structure. The key point from all of this is that all survivor testimonies, like all other historical documentation, are mediated to varying degrees and in varying ways. At the very least, we have to be aware of this mediation as we use these types of sources. Things get even trickier when we deal with the testimonies of former perpetrators and bystanders, people who have reasons to be less forthcoming. Thankfully, we have some guidance here, although not necessarily on our assigned readings. In a previous chapter in Chris Browning's 2011 book on Holocaust history and post-war testimony, he has a chapter on the multiple testimonies by Adolf Eichmann. Browning says that anyone who wants to dismiss Eichmann's testimonies on the grounds of their demonstrated unreliability and shameless self-serving lies can easily do so. But, Browning asks, what if our default position is not to dismiss everything Eichmann said and wrote just because he was lying most of the time, but rather to ask what among this mass of lies might nonetheless be of help to the historian, given his unique vantage point and the sheer volume of his testimony? How should one go about trying to sift nuggets of useful information from the mass of mendacious slug? Browning proposes a number of tactics that I think could be applied to any perpetrator testimony. First is what he calls the self-interest test. When Eichmann made statements against his self-interest, or when he was in a situation where telling the truth was in his self-interest, a closer look is merited. Secondly, the vividness test. When Eichmann described events with an unusual attention to the details of visual memory, the actual occurrence of those events should be seriously considered, even if Eichmann's framing of those events, in other words, the meaning of his participation in them, should still be viewed very skeptically. Third, the possibility test. When Eichmann's claims are not contradicted or proven impossible, even in light of the more extensive documentation now available, they should not be summarily rejected. And fourth, the probability test. When Eichmann's accounts coincide with, or fit a pattern of events suggested or established by other documentation, they can be viewed not only as possible, but also as probable. Now, the ethnographer and political scientist Leanne Fuji takes a somewhat different approach in dealing with the often less than forthcoming testimonies, not just of perpetrators, but also bystanders and other implicated subjects. While conducting her fieldwork in Rwanda, a decade after the genocide there, she encountered a number of rhetorical obstacles in her research subjects. As frustrating or difficult as they might have been, she did not approach these as roadblocks to the truth. Instead, she encourages us to rethink lying, denial, misinformation, and other forms of untruths as data that needs to be collected and analyzed. This data, she contends, can reveal people's interior thoughts and feelings, as well as indicate how the current social and political landscape is shaping what people might say to a researcher. Now, in order to put all of this together, we can use the concept of triangulation. This concept is borrowed from navigational and land surveying techniques, where it is used to locate a point from two others of known distance apart, given the angles of the triangle formed between the 3 points. As it applies to qualitative research, triangulation basically means approaching a research problem, issue, or question from multiple perspectives. This could be in terms of using more than one methodology. such as using microhistories and comparative analysis, for example, or content and discourse analysis. Triangulation also applies to the use of historical sources, in the sense of using more than one type of data source to examine an issue. This could mean using testimonies alongside archival documents, or even secondary sources. Although the concept itself is not widely used in Holocaust and genocide studies, the practice of data triangulation is actually quite common, especially when it comes to the use of testimonies. Given some of the limitations and challenges with using testimonies, the practice of triangulation enables us to use this critical reservoir of data by analyzing it alongside other sources. In an empirical sense, this method works best by searching for corroborating evidence that can be used to substantiate testimonies. Although with that said, corroboration isn't necessarily the key determinant or qualification for using triangulation. This method can also be used in a more stylistic or aesthetic sense, as demonstrated by the magna opera, i.e. the plural form of magnum opus, of the great historian Saul Friedlander. We'll get to his masterpieces in a moment, but first some context. Holocaust historiography had reached something of a stalemate in the 1980s, when, as I noted last week, the literature was marked by a strong sense of positivism and empiricism, very much in the vein of the traditional von Rankian approach to historiography. Scholars had taken their cues from the Nuremberg trials, where victim testimony was expressly excluded from the proceedings in favor of official documentation. In that sense, the literature was very much interpreted through the eyes of the perpetrators. It might be hard to believe now, and it's certainly easy to forget, that victim-based testimonies remained outside the broader academic canon and community. Many prominent scholars believed that victim-based historiography was too invested and wrapped up in traumatic memories to provide the necessary distance and detachment presumably required to undertake a proper, scholarly scientific investigation of genocidal past. That was what was at stake, for example, during the famous historians debate in West Germany during the late 1980s. Particularly with the highly regarded exchange between Friedlander and German historian Martin Brochot. It was in this context that Friedlander devised an integrated approach for his monumental 2-volume study of the Holocaust. As he explains in one of this week's supplementary readings, there are 3 characteristics to his concept of an integrated history. The first is the idea of expanding the scope of Holocaust history far beyond Germany, whereas the scope of action in the first volume, which covers the years 1933 to 39, naturally covers events in Germany. In the second volume, Friedlander masterfully weaves together the story of the annihilation of the Jews across wartime Europe. The second pivotal dimension of this integrated history is his endeavor to include the voices of the victims. The history of the Holocaust, he says, cannot be limited only to a recounting of German policies, decisions, and measures that led to this most systematic and sustained of genocides. It must include the reactions, and at times the initiatives, of the surrounding world and the attitudes of the victims, for the fundamental reason that the events we call the Holocaust represents a totality, defined by this very convergence of distinct elements. We'll talk about this some more momentarily. The third aspect of an integrated approach to the Holocaust mixes the first 2 elements into a simultaneous representation. Only the succession of phases, each presenting the synchronicity of events both throughout occupied Europe and within each country, can indicate the interrelatedness of this history. Friedlander's exemplary 2-volume history of the Holocaust has spawned its own wide-ranging body of secondary literature, such as our reading this week by Alan Confino, which analyzes Friedlander's narrative style, especially considering how his integrative approach works toward a peculiar historical sensibility, one that speaks to a sense of narrative truth that works on top of or in conjunction with the more traditional sense of historical truth. As used by Friedlander, victim testimony serves a disruptive function in the narrative. The core structure of his 2-volume history of the Holocaust follows a conventional emplotment that is periodically punctuated by a series of brief vignettes. The use of these quick cuts resembles that of a filmmaker or novelist, as the reader is alerted to the narrative of dislocation, characterized by moving from one scene to another by the ubiquitous double space that separates the scenes. This isn't just a stylistic convention, however, as Friedlander uses these testimonies to articulate the sense of disbelief and uncertainty that was distinctive of the Jewish experience during the Holocaust. In the intro to Friedlander's first volume, he writes that, in many works in Holocaust history, The implicit assumptions regarding the victim's generalized hopelessness and passivity have turned them into a static and abstract element of the historical background. Instead, he shows that their voices are essential for understanding the utter blindness of human beings confronted with an entirely new and utterly horrifying reality, thereby putting the Nazis' actions into full perspective. Victim testimony is thus utilized far more than simply as an illustrative device, used to bolster more traditional, objectivist-oriented Reconstructionist histories, much like in the vein of Chris Browning's work on the slave labor camp. More significantly, this type of integrative methodology speaks more to the intersubjective realities as they were experienced by the actual actors and subjects of history. Notably, this type of approach can be applied to other historical contexts and to different analytical ends. For example, American historian Jeffrey Osler deploys a sort of integrated approach in his various works on Native American genocides. We'll read parts of these two articles in my Modern Genocides class this spring, both of which work in conjunction to help us locate the possible existence of a genocidal intent on behalf of U.S. policymakers during the early Republic. In the first article, An Indigenous Consciousness of Genocide in the Ohio Valley and Lower Great Lakes, Osler uses ethno-historical evidence from indigenous voices to help register the sociological emergence of intent, as, from their perspective, the American government seemed intent on destroying indigenous peoples. And sure enough, in this second article, Osler demonstrates how what used to be referred to as extirpative warfare, extirpate is another way of saying exterminate, emerged as a viable policy option amongst American leaders during the late 18th and early 19th century. In sum, my point is simply that we can use an integrated approach in a variety of contexts and to any number of ends. It's not exclusive to Holocaust historiography, and can and should be applied to genocide studies more broadly. Okay, and that's pretty much it. This week we're starting a new assignment called Method Analysis. You've been given multiple selections from some of the best scholars in Holocaust and genocide studies, as well as samples from different PhD dissertations. Pick one or more of these readings and analyze the methods used by the authors. What technical practices did they use to identify research questions, collect and analyze data, and present findings? Focus especially on the techniques used to gather evidence. Where does their evidence come from, and how do the authors make sense of it? You are encouraged to think about how such methods may be applied to your own work. Also, by now you should have a good idea of what you want to do for your research proposal. Please reach out to me if you want to discuss. In any case, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.